Hi everyone, and thank you so much for joining me. Many of us accept it as truth that 50% of marriages end in divorce, but according to a recent article published in Forbes magazine, that stat only applies to first marriages. The hopeless romantics who refuse to give up on love and marry multiple times actually face a far higher rate of divorce, with 67% of second marriages and 73% of third marriages ending in divorce. So, what happens to your house when you get divorced? Here to shed light on this and so many other questions about divorce and real estate is my friend and trusted family law attorney, Joanna Sanchez of Sanchez Family Law. Joanna, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. Those statistics really floored me. I had no idea about the second and third marriages. I mean, do you have any comments on that being in the world that you are in? Does that surprise you
They
at all?
actually aren't very surprising to me at all. I do see more second and third marriages ending in divorce. There's usually one spouse after the divorce who kind of has already paired up and is ready to move on, and sometimes quickly thereafter marries. I see that more with men, to be honest.
Yeah.
More men remarry and do it faster, and sometimes those relationships don't work out. So,
Wow.
I've actually had one case where spouses got divorced, got remarried to each other, and divorced each other for the second time.
Oh, wow. Wow. I've heard of that happening, but not too often.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's not often, but it happens.
That's so funny. So, look, these people are married. They're more often than not buying real estate together. When the marriage falls apart, one of them files for divorce, there's always the question of the assets, largely the real estate that's owned. For the purposes of our conversation, let's just focus on the one home that they're living in, okay? What happens? What options do they have? I mean, I know you and I, in our discussions in business together, we've talked about really there are just two options. There's one spouse buying out the other, and then the sale of the home. Is it those two options, or is there anything else that we need to talk about?
That's absolutely correct. That's really what it is. One spouse is either going to buy out the other spouse's interest, or there's going to be a sale. That's really the only two options when you have a community residence and there's a divorce.
Let's focus on the buyout first, okay? And let's just really break it down for the audience. A buyout is exactly what it sounds like. One spouse buys out the interest of the other. So it's a sale, but as opposed to being sold to a third party, the home is being sold to the other spouse.
That's correct. So traditionally, parties have, everyone when they get married wants to buy a home. So that's usually
Sure.
the biggest asset that they have. And when it comes time for a divorce, then we're figuring out, what do we do with this house?
Yeah.
And if we could just cut it down the middle and give each party a piece, maybe that would work. I think now there's some zoning and different permitting for ADUs that maybe it's possible, but
that's been coming.
not traditional. So we're dealing with a buyout of the other spouse's interest. Usually when you have a house, one spouse might feel emotionally attached to the house. They may have raised their children there. They may have remodeled it to be exactly their dream home, and they don't want to give it up. So when it comes time for divorce, there's usually one spouse who wants to keep it for whatever reason. And so we're figuring out, how do we make that happen?
Right. So what are the procedures that go into the decision making? I mean, it's not just as easy as saying, well, I want to keep the house. I mean, we have to find out, can they afford to buy the other spouse out, right? How is the market value determined? So can you kind of just walk us through those
So in order
steps?
to have a buyout, you need to have one spouse, obviously, who wants to keep the home, and then they need to be financially able to do that. Because a buyout is really, what it really means is you need to pay your spouse for 1/2 the value of the home. So we're looking at what is the fair market value minus whatever debt. Usually there's a mortgage, there might be a second, a line of credit or something else. So we're taking the net value and figuring out what that is, and then they need to be able to pay their spouse 1/2 of that. If it was a recent home purchase, sometimes it's very easy to do. You may not need to refinance. You may have some savings where you can just pay your spouse. Most cases, their property has appreciated. They may have bought it 10, 20 years ago. It's
Right.
appreciated substantially over the duration of the marriage, and it's not so easy to find, let's say $500,000 to just pay your spouse to be able to buy out their interest.
Right.
So they're usually having to get a refinance, and in order to do that, they need to qualify for the loan, right? Just as you would qualify for a traditional home purchase.
Sure. Yeah, so they'll have to look at their income, their assets, their ability to pay, employment, and see if solo they can qualify to take
Right.
on this financial responsibility.
Correct.
Right.
There's a little more consideration, I say, that would go into it when there's a divorce, just because we're inevitably going to consider support, whether there's minor children or there's spousal support.
Sure.
And sometimes you can't figure that out early on in the case, and people need to wait a while. Some people are very anxious. They want to kick their spouse out of the home and buy out their interest and just be done. And it can't be done for a lot of reasons, but primarily because they need to qualify. That's not easy to do when you don't know what your expenses are.
Right.
And if you're having to pay support, how do you factor that into qualifying for the loan and also qualifying for the mortgage, right? They're going to look at your debt-to-income ratios. That needs to be part of the conversation.
Let's talk real quick before we get into the value of the home and the appraisal that may need to be done in terms of evaluation. You just mentioned something about like the financials. As part of the divorce process, each party to the divorce needs to come up with and produce their financials, right? It's not just like, oh, I want to get divorced. Okay, fine. I agree that I want to get divorced too. Let's just get divorced. I mean, there's a lot of prep that needs to be done
Yes.
before like real decisions can be made, whether the parties are jointly agreeing to it or they're going to need to go to trial, right? So can you shed some light on what those financial disclosures are?
I'm so glad that you said that, because most people think you can get a quick and easy divorce. And one of the reasons that you can is because the financial disclosures are essential. You may not get divorced in California unless you have done your financial disclosures. And traditionally, both parties need to do them. There's really two parts to it. There is the income and expense part, where you have to disclose what are you making, per month, whether it's from employment, rental income, interest. Maybe you have a trust fund, you have a business, whatever it is. What are your assets? What are the value of those assets? And then what are your monthly expenses? That part is never fun for anybody.
Right.
I tell people, here's your homework, go home, try to estimate what your monthly expenses are. The other part of it is figuring out what is the value of your assets and debts. When it comes to real estate, sometimes early on in the case, we're not quite ready to deal with a buyout or a sale, and people might kind of estimate the value of their home for that purpose, for the purpose of the financial disclosure. You go online and people inevitably are going to use Zillow and Redfin to whatever,
any of those sites
to come up with the value. And that's fine for that purpose, but it doesn't necessarily mean that your home is going to be valued at that value when it comes time to divide the asset, whether it's through a buyout or a sale.
Okay, so let us now delve into that appraisal. So let's say one spouse wants to buy the other one out and the other one is agreeable to being bought out. Is a formal appraisal needed? Do the parties each need to go out and get their own appraiser? Or can one of them just go online and come up with the online valuation and they'll see if they agree? Let's talk about that.
Right. So an appraisal is not required, but it's often the method that is used for parties to come to an agreement on the value, because we all know you can't really trust what you find online. A Google search is only worth so much. And how do you find out what the value is? Usually, so when there's a divorce, I'll say this, you have two people who are usually in opposite positions, and they will do whatever they can to gain an advantage, right? That's part of what an adversarial process is. It's litigation. So the person who wants to keep the home inevitably will want the home to be valued as low as possible
Right.
Because they want to pay the least amount to their spouse.
Yeah.
And
Well, it's like any buyer wants to pay as little for the home as possible. Nobody wants to overpay. So yeah, it's that same mentality that goes into a divorce situation.
So I guess in that way it is a lot just like a traditional sale, except their spouse is getting a divorce.
Right.
So for that reason, we often turn to an appraisal. Sometimes one appraisal isn't good enough, right? Because can we actually get the parties to agree on an appraiser? Sometimes the answer is no. Sometimes someone went out and got an appraisal done early on and they want to rely on that, and the other spouse had no input, and so they feel like that's not fair. So they want to get their own appraisal. And then when you have that, we're figuring out, do we take like the average of them, or do we get another third appraisal to try to come to some agreement that might be in the middle, or it might be, closer to one spouse or the other. So there's different ways to do it, but an appraisal is usually the method that is used in a divorce when we're talking about how do we value the property for a buyout.
More often than not, some form of appraisal is done, whether it's with one appraiser or two or three or however many is needed. It's sounding like this process could be as easy or complicated as the parties choose to make it be. Okay, so now the value has been determined. Let's say it's not super adversarial. Let's say it's a little more of an amicable situation. Value has been set. What happens next?
So the spouse who wants to buy out the interest needs to qualify for a loan. They need to make the effort, go out and actually talk to lenders and qualify for the loan, and hopefully qualify for enough to be able to buy their spouse out. If they cannot do that, then we're talking about some other options. But as long as they can qualify for enough to pull out equity of the home and pay their spouse, then the buyout will go through. The loan will get processed. There's usually going to be some set date for the spouse to be paid. In exchange, they're going to sign a transfer deed, giving up the interest in the house so that the other spouse can keep it.
In that case, is an actual purchase agreement necessary, or is it just a transfer from
It's just a
deed?
transfer. We don't do a purchase agreement. There will be a written agreement or stipulation or a judgment that gets filed with the court. So there is some formal documents done, but it's not as I think extensive as what a purchase agreement would be.
So would it be like a quit claim deed or like an interspousal type
Traditionally
deed?
we do an interspousal transfer deed.
Okay. Okay. And so once that agreement is reached, financing is completed, deed is transferred. That pretty much makes the buyout complete.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. What happens if, because not all divorces are friendly, what if they just cannot come to an agreement on the buyout amount? Or what if they don't even come eye to eye on, whether one should buy the other one out? What if one is really intent on selling and the other one's really intent on buying out? At what point does this kind of stuff go to court?
It takes some time, but sometimes we also have people, they both want to buy the house, right? And
I didn't even think of that. Yeah, they're fighting over the house.
They both can't stay there. They both can't do that. So if there is no agreement for a buyout, the only option really is a sale. People can go to court and request the buyout. A judge may give them some time to try that, but they need to have proof that they actually qualify, because the court doesn't want to see that you're just wasting time, dragging things out. So if a buyout is not possible, the only other option is to sell the house and then just split the proceeds. And
whether the parties are happy about it or not.
Right.
Oftentimes it just seems like it comes down to their ability to do a buyout and their ability to cooperate, actually.
Right, and sometimes those are really difficult things.
Right,
Both.
Right. If they could cooperate, they probably wouldn't be getting divorced. Right. Okay. So now let's talk about the sale scenario. So one way or another, amicably or not, the home is going to be sold. What happens next in that situation?
So I always caution people to make sure you have a stipulation in writing prior to the sale. Because we're dealing with an adversarial process, there's lots of steps in a sale, as you know. Hiccups can happen, and when that happens in a divorce, it can drag out the process for a very long time, and you can't have a long sale process, right? As you know, there's deadlines. There's an offer, an acceptance, and there's all these deadlines happening. Meanwhile, if some party to the divorce doesn't act, it can really delay things, and it can really throw the sale.
It could just derail the whole
totally
thing.
derail it.
Yeah.
We always advise clients to make sure they have an agreement in writing ahead of time that's going to spell out how are we going to determine who the realtor is. Do we have one that we agree to, or are we going to, someone's going to list, propose 3, and the other spouse will pick one from the list. What's the list price going to be? How long are we going to have it on the market? Who's going to pay for any repairs that need to be done? What if there needs to be staging? Is this a home that they lived in for 30 years and we need to get rid of all of this stuff that people accumulate? Where's it going to go? Who's going to pay the storage? We need to figure some of those things out in advance. In addition, one of the issues that comes up frequently in a divorce is one spouse doesn't really want the sale, right? Maybe they wanted to do the buyout and they couldn't qualify, so they're not cooperating. So everything's agreed upon, they agree upon the value, the purchase price, all of that. But when it comes down to signing the purchase agreement, they're nowhere to be found.
Yeah. They're not willing to show the home. They're not willing to let people in.
Right. We have terms that say you must cooperate with the realtor, specifically for that reason, making sure the home is clean.
Right.
So,
and not sabotaging the deal otherwise. Yeah, so it seems like in addition to the normal real estate agreement that the parties would sign with their broker, there is a whole other agreement pre-listing that the parties would agree to about how the sale is to be conducted and the terms that they agree to in order to accomplish the end goal, which whether they're happy about it or not in this circumstance is the sale of the home.
Right, and one of the most important parts about the agreement that we do prior to the sale is figuring out what happens to the net sale proceeds. Like what happens to the money that you get? Are we splitting it 50-50? Is there some type of reimbursement that's going to be paid? Maybe the person who paid for the repairs wants to get that reimbursed first before they split the proceeds. And if there is no agreement, when it comes, when the sale happens, escrow doesn't want to hold on to the money.
Right.
They want to pay it out, right? They don't want to hold it. And if there's no agreement and both parties don't sign, then again, we're kind of stuck. We need to go to court, get a court order to decide what happens to those proceeds. So it's best to figure that out prior to the sale so you're not in limbo.
Yeah, a lot of what I do as a real estate broker, and I believe what you do too as a family law attorney, is setting expectations properly and also bringing the experience that each of us has to the table for our clients in their various scenarios. We are already really well versed on the common pitfalls and other issues that could derail an otherwise straightforward transaction, And so having these conversations up front is one thing when everyone's on board. It is another thing in a highly contentious situation where everything could become a lot more complicated than it has to be, just because emotions and ego and spite can be involved in a divorce situation, especially. So let's talk a little bit about, because we can go down the rabbit hole about community property, separate property, all of these kinds of different avenues that could have such different outcomes for each individual person. So I realize that not everything that we are talking about today is applicable to any one particular person. Like everybody who is going through this situation for themselves will really need to get their proper individualized advice. But for the purposes of this, let's say it's 50-50 community property. They put equal amount of money in there. They bought it while they were married. And now it comes time to sell the home. Certain considerations need to be made, like is the home going to be improved before they put it on the market? Who is going to pay for these improvements? Will it be paid upfront or can it be paid post-closing? I know through my brokerage, I'm able to offer a service where certain key improvements that could add value to the home can be made prior to putting the home on the market at no upfront cost. It'll just be paid through escrow, which probably makes it a lot easier for people in this kind of a situation. How often do you find that once the decision has been made by the court or otherwise, that the process can go along rather smoothly? Is it really just up to the people's emotional and mental state? Or are there other factors where like the court can just say, that's enough, this is what's happening?
It definitely largely depends on their emotional state and how willing they are to cooperate.
Okay.
And it's not so easy to just say like, oh, we'll just go to court, because court is time and money. And you don't get a hearing right away usually. So, it might take months before you have a hearing. That means that the house is not being sold for all those months. You're just waiting to get a court order.
And that could definitely have an impact on the value of the home as well. I mean, the market is a living, breathing,
constantly changing.
It is constantly changing. So waiting 3 months, 4 months, I mean, I guess it could work to your advantage in an appreciating market, but it could certainly do the exact opposite in a softening market. So it behooves people to kind of really be smart about the choices that they're making, and perhaps look at the bigger picture and say, okay, what environment are we in right now? Is this fighting? Is this not coming to an agreement, helping us or hurting us in
the ultimate
the
ultimate like division of your property, right? Because at the end of the day, there's going to be some amount that you're going to receive out of the estate, and is it going to go up or down based on your actions?
Right.
Time, we can't really predict over time how things go. Sometimes people in their mind usually think, oh, it's going to go up, I'm going to wait, I'll sit back, it's going to appreciate. That wasn't true for the last, maybe year or two, where things were kind of stable. So it really does depend on the market as to what the value is going to be, but sometimes it's out of our hands as to how long it's going to take.
Right. So it seems like from a procedural perspective, a divorce sale is really just the same as a standard sale. There is no real additional paperwork or anything, no special disclosures outside of the ordinary home sale disclosures that would need to be done when a divorcing couple is selling a home. It seems like what's really going to make or break the success of the sale is really the work that's done up front, the agreements that are determined between the parties up front as to how smoothly the transaction will or will not go.
Right, and also keeping in mind that the sale is usually the very last thing that's going to happen in a divorce. So the divorce has usually been pending for some time, maybe a couple years. Unfortunately, it's just what happens sometimes.
Yeah.
And so in a divorce, we're not dividing assets right away. We're taking time to do the financial disclosures, make sure we have all the information, we know what there is, we have done our due diligence, meaning we know what the values of things are, and now we're ready to deal with either a settlement or a trial. And either way, usually the sale of the home, because we need to agree to the sale first,
right?
Or a court needs to determine it's going to order the sale, and then the sale has to happen. So sometimes there's kind of like a long tail on a case, which is wrapping up that sale. So it doesn't happen right away, although most people want it. They think like, I'm going to file, we're going to sell our house, and the attorney is like, no, you're not going to sell your house as the first thing you're going to do. Here's the financial disclosure you're going to do first.
Right. So in terms of the order of things, somebody files for divorce. Side question, is there a benefit or consequence of being the one to file for divorce versus the one who divorce is being filed against? I mean, let's talk about that. Is there
usually not really. It doesn't really matter who files first. California is a no-fault state, so
what does that mean?
What that means is we don't really care why you're getting a divorce. No one is going to have any advantage. What it really comes down to is, was there some infidelity? And people want to know, well, my husband or wife cheated. Don't I get to keep the house because they did this horrible thing to me? And the answer is no. It doesn't matter the reason for the divorce. So there's no advantage to really filing first or not. Usually, sometimes there might be some considerations, but generally it doesn't really matter who files first. The other person is going to do the exact same type of paperwork that needs to be done when they file their response.
Got it. So step one to getting divorced is deciding that you want to file for divorce. Then you would file, essentially. Then the financial disclosures would be made. And then pre that, the parties usually select their own attorneys, assuming they're not going to mediate.
Right.
They each hire their own counsel. They then fill out financial disclosures, and then the attorneys come together and start going through all the paperwork, doing their diligence about each person's circumstances, and negotiations begin.
Right.
Essentially.
Right. Essentially,
one party says, here's what I want. The other party says, here's what I want. And then you guys try to figure out, okay, how are we going to make this work?
How can we get each party some of what they want? Because I can't give them everything.
Yeah.
It just doesn't work out that way. And how can we reach an agreement? That's generally the way it works. Is there's a filing, disclosures, and then some discussions, negotiations, trying to figure out how can we get closer to a settlement if we're not quite there yet.
Right.
Where is someone willing to give up on a certain claim in order to get something else? And sometimes we don't reach agreements on everything, and there might be just one issue for trial. That happens more frequently than having a trial on every issue.
Oh, I see. Okay, so the trial doesn't necessarily mean that all issues are going to trial. You can have total agreement on every issue except for this one matter that they just can't come to terms on. So everything else is agreed to, and now the trial will determine the outcome of that one particular issue.
So assume it's two parties and they have children, and there was a stay-at-home parent who wasn't working. Spousal support's going to be an issue. They've agreed they want to share equal custody. They've agreed on selling their house and dividing the assets, but what they can agree upon is the amount of support, because we have one spouse who wasn't working during the marriage, and we're figuring out, should we impute any income to that spouse or not? And that tends to be an issue that gets tried, is figuring out the amount of support that should get paid. It's a highly contentious area.
Right.
More so probably than I would even say a sale of a home.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I can see how that could be. In terms of the home sale, from your experience, having been in this industry for so long and having helped so many people through divorce, I think 16 years that you've been in family law, what would you say is the top pieces of advice that you would give people that are going through a divorce when it comes to their real estate? Granted, there are so many other considerations as well, but for the purposes of our talk, when it comes to divorce and real estate, what's the best advice that you would like your clients or the viewers to take away from this?
Earlier you talked about setting expectations, and that's so important. And I think clients need to be realistic about their ability to buy out their spouse's interests, about the value of their home. Some people come in with high hopes, they want it valued really high, and it's just not realistic. And so the more you have counsel that can help guide you on what is a more likely outcome, I think the easier it will be for you to get through your case, and easier for you to settle and be done and move forward.
Yeah, I like what you said about moving forward. I think it's easy for people to get all caught up in the emotionality of it. There's spite, there's hurt, there's regret. There could be a whole bunch of emotional factors that could ultimately get in the way of coming to a decision that could just allow you to have peace and just move on, because time keeps ticking, life keeps moving on, regardless of whether or not you are stuck in this contentious situation.
Right, and most people I always say, they want their divorce done yesterday, right?
Right.
They come to you and they wanted it done already. And we're trying to figure out, how can we efficiently get you to the next step? I want my clients to move on. I want them to be happy and put this part of their life behind, but it takes time. And we need to be realistic about that time. I think I mentioned to you earlier that California does have a 6-month waiting period.
Yeah.
which means that you cannot get divorced, meaning you cannot change your marital status from married to single person until 6 months after the petition has been filed and served. So that's another reason why we don't have quickie divorces.
Yeah. So that's at minimum, that's 6 months before you can get divorced.
Right.
Right.
Right. That's the minimum. That's by statute. So
how long would you say on average a non-contentious divorce would take? Let's say they don't even hire attorneys and they just decide to mediate. That's probably the least contentious you could probably get, right? Like, we agree on a mediator, we're agreeing on everything.
Yeah, if they agree, I think it could be done in a couple of months. So you don't necessarily
after the 6 months.
You don't necessarily have to wait. So what happens sometimes is you file and you get your paperwork done, you reach agreements, you put those agreements into a formal document called a judgment. That is actually a judgment that changes your marital status and divides all the property. And then you can submit that to the court, and the court will just hold on to it until the 6 month period has ended, and then they will stamp it, sign it, and send it back to you.
Oh, okay.
So it might be done earlier, but you won't actually be divorced until the 6 months.
Six months.
It happens. If it's totally a situation where they agree, they communicate well, and they don't have disagreements on anything, and they don't have to go to court, then it can be done in a few months. Unfortunately, those are just not the people that I see, because the ones I see need attorneys because there's some issue and dispute. So it happens. It's possible for people to do their divorce without attorneys.
Right.
It is possible. Maybe not always recommended, but it happens.
Yeah. Fascinating. Is there anything that we haven't covered in terms of the sale scenario that you think is important for us to touch on? I feel like we went pretty in depth in both the buyout and the sale. I just, sometimes I don't know what I don't know. So I figured I would ask you in case there was anything that we may have missed.
I think we pretty much covered the sale and the buyout under the assumption that it's a community residence and there is no separate property claim, because that kind of muddies the water a bit. But that's generally the way that it works in a buyout and a sale, and I think we've covered that fairly thoroughly.
Okay.
I did want to just comment, maybe it's a bit of a correction, and I don't mean it to be rude. But
no, please correct. This is why we have these conversations, because, like I said,
people
you're the
assume
expert.
that it's a community property residence, and you had said somewhere that we each put 50% in.
Yeah.
Which doesn't have to be the case, right? Because if you have community property is anything that is acquired during the marriage. It doesn't really matter whose income that the down payment came from. If you're married and you put that money in savings and then you buy the house, it's community. So let's say the husband was the high wage earner and he put his income paid for the house, right? He paid the down payment, he was paying the mortgage. It's still 50% the other spouse's, right? Property. So it doesn't have to be that they each put an equal amount down. If it was during the marriage with community funds, it is community property, and it's going to be divided 50-50 regardless of who was actually working. I should say it that way.
I'm glad you brought that up, because when we were talking like a couple days ago in preparation for today, I remember I just learned so much in that brief conversation that we had, that it was so mind-blowing as to how intricate and detailed marriage and divorce could be from a legal perspective. And especially when it comes down to determining who is owed what, and I know today we're just talking about the intersection of our professions, which is real estate and family law. But as part of what you do, it's not just the real estate. There's business. What happens to the income? What if both spouses are working? What if only one spouse is working and is a W-2 wage earner? What if that sole working spouse has his or her own business?
Right.
Does that become part of the community? I mean, the things that I learned were just mind-blowing, and it just goes to show that there are so many other elements of this that we haven't even scratched the surface. I mean, and right now we've just been talking about married couples. Right. We haven't even talked about couples that aren't married but are cohabitating.
Right.
You know, there's that whole...
And they buy property together.
And they buy property together. We haven't even talked about the situation where, okay, it's a married couple, but before they got married, each of them had their own real estate, and maybe they signed a prenuptial agreement. Maybe they didn't sign a prenuptial agreement.
Maybe they sold those residences and then bought something
and
together.
bought something else. And like, nothing says romance like a prenup, right? So, I mean, we can talk about that as well. So I think it just goes to show that when making such big life decisions, from getting married to getting divorced to buying property to acquiring other assets, the planning is really important. It's really essential. And, you know, it's very easy to get caught up in the emotionality and the hearts and flowers, and it's so romantic and everything is great, and more power to those people for sure. And at the same time, you have to think about, you know, not anticipate the worst case scenario and thinking, well, I'm going to get married and it's probably going to end up in divorce,
50%,
you know, 50% and for your first marriage, you know. But it is really important to, you know, perhaps hire counsel before you get married and really identify what's important to you and how are you going to protect your assets, protect the community's assets. How do you want to see these things unfold? And I think it's an important consideration that not a lot of people think as in depth about as they probably should.
You're absolutely correct. I know of some couples that have done some type of financial counseling before they got married, not necessarily with an attorney, but with a counselor, in order to flush out some of those issues. It's important to think about them. I don't think, maybe not everybody needs to have a prenup, but I think you need to have an idea of what's going to happen when you get married. There's lots of rights and obligations and things that will automatically happen when you get married, and most people have no idea.
Yeah.
And it's important to just at least know them.
They don't teach this in school.
They don't teach it in school. They don't teach it when people do this like premarital counseling. It's not about that. Not talking about assets. You're not talking about debt. My student debt. You know, who's going to be responsible for this?
Right.
So it's important to at least, I think, talk about it and have some idea of what you and your partner want to do about those things, or have some agreements about them. Obviously, the more assets you have when you get married, the more you're going to want to protect them. And that's when a prenup becomes really important, is when you have either a business, you know, real estate, any kind of savings, retirement that you want to protect.
This sounds like the perfect segue for our next video, okay? Because I feel like we can keep talking forever about all the different intricacies of family law. I would love to have you back to talk about prenups in a lot more detail if you would come back with me here in studio, and that'll be like another really awesome topic for us to explore.
A juicy one.
You know, I bet. I'm sure you have stories you can share. Thank you so much for being here. You're such a pro at what you do, and you have such a wonderful way about you that I know your clients appreciate the care that you give to them through really a difficult time. I mean, some people can be really happy through divorce because they feel like, yes, I see the light at the end of the tunnel and I'm like, I can see my freedom, you know. For others, it's not that. So there's like a whole gamut of emotions and issues that I'm sure you deal with. And I think you're just such a gem. So thank you so much for devoting your time to being here with me today. To you, the viewers, you know my heart is always with you. I always just want to be a valuable resource to you in any part of your life. I'm a real estate broker that has a passion for helping people in a holistic manner, which is why I bring incredible guests like Joanna here today. Until next time, please take care of yourselves, and I look forward to seeing you really soon.